Awesome. So thank you, everyone, including our Valley girl here from the Valley in California. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited for today. My name is Ariam from Cooley's team, and I'll be speaking with Ann Crommett, founder and CEO of Collective Moxie. We're going to be talking about DEI storytelling and how that translates to a really inclusive culture. So you'll be getting some really cool takeaways that you can bring into your own organizations, your own lives. I know we're really excited to discuss, the power of narrative today. So as you may already know, Julianne previously was a part of the team at Walt Disney Studios, where she contributed to projects like Black Panther and Encanto. She has a really unique approach to DEI through the lens of storytelling, which is one of my favorite that I've heard so far. I know she has a really unique perspective, so I'm really excited. Let's jump in. Awesome. So I'll give Julianne a chance to introduce herself. Julianne, I will kick it to you.
Hi, everyone. Ann Crommett, pronouns she, her, ella. I'm a proud Puerto Rican and Cuban American, now hailing from Atlanta, Georgia, which is where I grew up. Really excited to be with you all today. I'll talk a little bit about my story of how I've become a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner over 14 years in media and tech. For today's discussion, really want to be hearing from you all in the chat. I'm happy to answer questions, at the end as we go through this conversation. And hopefully we'll get to talk about some of your all's favorite topics. And then just a little bit, yay, Boricua, look, I'm already getting it in the chat. Yes. All right. Woohoo. And hopefully today we'll feel interactive and also touching upon maybe some of your favorite titles or maybe, pieces of content you haven't heard of or about. And as we were prepping for this, Ariam and I were talking about the opportunity for people to be able to go right after and dive into the great content that's out there, including some of the stuff we'll talk about today. So again, I'm really excited to be here, and I'll tell you a little bit more about my journey and Collective Moxie in a second.
Awesome. We're really excited. Super pumped for the energy in the chat. Really excited for the conversation. So before we jump into the official content, Julianne, could you tell us a little bit more about Collective Moxie, your organization?
Sure, absolutely. So everybody, collectivemoxie.com if you want to visit. But so Collective Moxie was an organization I started back in 2021 when I left the Walt Disney Company in looking to sort of take the diversity, equity, and inclusion practices when it comes to narrative change work and inclusive storytelling across multiple different industries, companies, and organizations. We believe that change takes our collective moxie, takes all of us, and it takes that little extra bit of elbow grease, as I like to say, together to get it done. We're rooted in joy because joy is an act of resistance in and of itself. And that we believe that in doing this work together and collectively, we can actually find liberation as well as the change, hopefully, that we all seek or should seek in this world in terms of equity and inclusion. I'll say our three major areas of work are strategy work. So we work with organizations, large and small, ranging from everywhere from what you might think of as traditional storytelling places like studios or advertising agencies, to tech companies, to foundations and nonprofits, and everything in between. We do everything from strategic advisement and helping folks actually build a narrative change strategy, whatever that might look like in their organization, or even diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies more broadly, but with an angle or a lens around communication and storytelling. We also do project-specific work where we'll look at either a specific project that folks who want feedback on, either because it's a creative project, right, or a story that they're looking for input or to connect with community partners, or that it is a piece of content somebody's developing. So for example, with a client right now, we're helping to develop a leadership institute that's centered around creative middle managers in who identify as women and or gender non-binary. And we're really excited about what that could look like in the scaling of something like that. And also we do workshops and educational pieces. So kind of like what I'm doing with you today with RM, we also look at how can we educate and build competency, specifically cultural competency within organizations when it comes to inclusive storytelling and inclusive storytelling practices. And then a third area of work, which is much smaller, is I also do one-on-one coaching, particularly with creatives who are tackling either something within a specific project or more broadly are trying to be better and inclusive leaders in the creative space, and how can they do that? So that's a little bit about Collective Moxie. Really thrilling to be sharing again with you all today and diving in deeper. And if you want to learn more, again, collectivemoxie.com.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much, Julianne. Your organization is doing really incredible work. That was fantastic. So yeah, if anyone would like to visit the website, Teresa has put it in the chat. So yeah, thank you so much again, Julie, for being here. Really excited. So just a brief agenda for today. First, I'll share a little bit about CoolLeaf's platform and how we can really transform DEI strategies. And then Julianne and I will jump into the conversation around her journey and crafting really powerful narratives to really help enhance DEI strategies. Do be sure to stick around until the end, where we'll share a SHRM activity code for recertification, as well as resources that are some of our favorites for getting your own strategy started. So again, if you do have questions for Julianne, please put them in the Q&A chat box. We will do an audience Q&A at the end. Perfect. So a little bit about CoolLeaf. What we do is really help companies to engage their employees and bring them together and create a culture where they feel really valued and really seen. I don't know about a lot of you, but I know that that's a huge priority for myself, and a huge priority for our team is really making sure that everybody feels that within their organization. So the way that we do that is by developing really robust strategies to help organizations just help their employees feel like where they work is really a safe place, a place that they love to be. And that's by fostering a sense of togetherness. So what our integrated platform allows you to do is bring together challenges, activities, recognitions, whether it's peer-to-peer or from team leads to employees, to really create a sense of belonging for everybody within your organization. So organizations host book clubs, different DEI activities, and even employee resource groups is really becoming a growing piece on CoolLeaf. So yeah. That's a little bit about us. And something that is new for 2023 that we're really excited about is DEI content, a DEI content package. So this programming is really exclusive to CoolLeaf and all of the work that we do around DEI, and our phenomenal customer success managers are behind this programming. So they put together an amazing package that includes original programming, activities, and a lot of resources for really continuous DEI strategies. And yeah, this is great because it's really easy to maintain over time, and they've made everything really easy. They've put it all in one place. So if you'd like to learn more about this, you can give us a shout in the chat or email us, or go to the website and get in touch that way. Fantastic. So lastly, we do have a challenge for everyone here today. So whether you're a part of CoolLeaf already or you'd like to be, this challenge is available to you. So defining inclusive storytelling is what the challenge centers around. So challenges are one of the most popular ways on CoolLeaf that organizations facilitate DEI engagement. So team members can come together, and specifically with this challenge, they'll get the chance to define inclusive storytelling, but then interact with their peers based on how they define inclusive storytelling. So they'll watch this webinar and then they can engage around that. But this is really one example of the challenges on Cool Leaf that help to foster inclusion. Teams host challenges and activities around Pride Month, Black History Month, Asian American and Pacific Islander History Month, and that's just really to name a few. So if you're interested in this challenge, it is available on Cool Leaf now. If you'd like to implement it, you can talk to your customer success manager or get in touch with us via the chat or the website. Awesome. So now the moment we have all been waiting for, let's get into these questions. So Julianne, I'd love to kick off and learn more about your journey into the DEI space. So could you just tell us how you came into the space? Yeah.
Absolutely. And just a quick note, because you brought up sort of heritage months. Today is the beginning of Black History Month. So just want to shout out celebration all year round. I'll be talking about some examples that stem into Black history and identity, but really thrilling to join you today on that. So a little bit about my career journey. So like a lot of practitioners in this space, you don't really have a linear path. And you're all probably thinking, why is she standing with mine? Well, I actually, fun fact, I played on Jeopardy last year on May 19th. For anybody who wants to check out the episode, I faced who ended up becoming super champ, Ryan Long, who won 16 games and ended up in the Tournament of Champions. So I was one of the people who lost to Ryan Long. That will be forever my claim to fame on Jeopardy. But a little trivia fact about me is I'm a super trivia nerd and play bar trivia every Thursday night here in the Atlanta area. So, and yeah, my team is in the city finals on Sunday. So, everybody, anybody who's a trivia nerd out there, I love you. I'm here for you. I see you. So just a little explanation on the photo. But a little bit about my journey. I think that everybody comes into this work in different ways. Myself, obviously, I have a lived experience of having grown up as Latina in the United States, in the South, where I didn't see or interact with a lot of people of my own background and culture, and obviously steeped in, Atlanta culture, which is really Black culture in many ways in the South, and the implications and beauty of the civil rights movement as well. And so I always think about those pieces of the puzzle. In many ways, Atlanta formed me in many ways, I would say. And then when I went to college, I love people living in the chat, by the way, this is great. When I went to college, I started the Latino, Latinx, Latina theater troupe at Harvard, which is still going to this day, Harvard College Teatro. And I was actually directly inspired by Black Cast, which was the Black theater troupe on campus. I started producing plays with them and then asked the question, wait a second, we should be looking at the canon that comes from Latinos in Latin America, right, as well. And the students have kept it alive in beautiful ways. By the way, the 10th anniversary production was in the Heights, by Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's another Boricua, just for folks echoing in the chat. And when I look back, I think it kind of all started there in a way. This idea of when I met with the head of the Office of the Arts at Harvard, who was a straight, cis, white, middle-aged man, he asked me, do you think enough people will audition and do you think enough people will come? And at 20 years old, I thought this was a ridiculous question. And as it turned out, we sold out by closing night and had 50 people audition for the show. Our cast and crew were actually 50% from the Boston community and 50% from the university, as well as our audience. And so I think what that taught me early in hindsight is that you cannot account for audiences you haven't been accounting for, right? And so if you build it, they will come, as long as you do it well, as I like to say. And you meet people where they are and talk to them in a way that actually translates and communicates. And for me, the origin actually really starts there of the whole story. I actually ended up working in production when I left college. I worked at Pixar very briefly on Wall-E and Up on the DVDs and promos for those who love those films. And then ended up in reality television production, which is a whole other discussion for another day. But it was an animal attack survivor show called I'm Alive, for anybody who's a fan of those types of shows, and was quickly not my cup of tea per se. And I called the only person I knew in all of Los Angeles at that point. That's what moved me there, was another Puerto Rican guy named Jose Andino. And he changed the course of my life. He said, there is this job in what they called diversity at the time, and drama programming And I thought to myself, that sounds great. I have no idea what that is, but it sounds great. And I went in, convinced them I could answer phones and solve problems, and started a almost now 14-year career in DEI work. That has taken me from NBC Universal, where I was for 5 years. By the time I left, I was running or co-running the behind the camera talent programs for writers and directors. Helped launch the careers of about 50 television writers and 8 television directors, all from underrepresented identities or intersections therein. And many of those writers are now running the shows that we're watching today, including a personal favorite that's been canceled, which is Gordita Chronicles, for anybody who was watching that on HBO Max platform. I also, got the experience of actually being trained as a creative executive in that time and sort of diving into the creative process. So my journey in DEI comes always from a storytelling creative first angle, which is what ideas are we communicating? Who's communicating them? How can we think about debunking stereotypes or single narratives that have existed as part of that, and tell a richer and more complete story? I think for me, the North Star is always that the world that we see on screen should reflect the world that we currently live in off screen and the one we wish to see in the future. Because quite frankly, policy is all great and good, but the only way in which we actually move forward together is that we share in narratives that actually express our shared humanity and actually the specificity of different experiences, because that's actually how we get to know each other. If you don't know somebody who's of a particular background, intersection of identity, then the only thing you may know about that group of people is from the stories you're consuming. And so the responsibility in storytelling is to consider for all the single narratives that have existed, all the stereotypes, and say, are we actually telling a complete picture and who's present for that conversation? So, that's a bit about me. Fast forwarding through the bio, ended up working at Google, led DEI in Latin America for many years. I'm happy to talk about that further. Worked in Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia. And then, which also very much brought a global perspective into the work for me personally. And then led the image of STEM work at Google, which allowed me to really bring engineers and storytellers together to have really awesome and productive conversations. And then most recently, I built the practice at the Walt Disney Studios, which we're going to talk about a few examples in a moment, but across Marvel, Lucas, Pixar, Disney Animation, Disney Live Action, the stage plays, Searchlight, and 20th. And then I launched Collective Moxie therein, which you heard a bit about. So that's me. That's the crazy journey. And it's been a real blessing, I have to say. It's been a real blessing.
I am so excited for us to get into these stories. They are some of my favorites. I feel like you could tell them around a campfire, and people would be just as engaged. They're seriously incredible. But I do want to ask specifically about inclusive storytelling and why it's so important right now. So can you tell us why, you think it matters in this moment?
Absolutely. I think, I talked a little bit about this now in the bio story, but that, truly how we understand each other in this information world that we're receiving so much in terms of inputs through the internet, right, through various different sources of information or disinformation at the moment. And when we think about that history of a singular narrative, right, or of stereotypes that have persisted throughout a lot of modern human history, stem in places about power, right? And from places of colonialism and other things in our history. Why inclusive storytelling is so important right now is that we are being bombarded with all of those pieces of information. And so the narratives, right, that we're understanding about each other are becoming more and more fractured. And so when you think about this concept of inclusion, it's actually the idea of bringing together of people feeling, right, like they are part of a whole. And I think we as humans, especially because of the pandemic, are really seeking a sense of feeling like part of the whole, especially if you yourself or a community you come from has traditionally felt excluded for whatever reason, right? And I think these feelings of exclusion have compounded over the last several years, everything from that separation of information, right? to the actual experiences of what the pandemic has meant in your life in different ways or in the lives of people you know. And then to the racial and social justice reckonings that we're having right now, both the United States and around the world, that continue and have existed long before the pandemic. And I think that when you couple all of that together, on top of what's happening economically, we're in a moment, an inflection moment in time where coming together, as you said, around a campfire, the idea of the things that bring our hearts and heads together and invite all of us in, and that's often through specificity and storytelling, which feels counterintuitive, right? We need that right now. We need it at a human level, and I think, quite frankly, we need it at a societal level in order to be able to work together toward the future we're trying to build. And then I think when you think about it from a business perspective, it's a no-brainer. How are you not speaking and engaging with audiences, right? And we talk about community all the time. That's the buzzword right now, with communities that have formed, right? And actually inform each other into some sort of shared narrative, because that actually is going to bring them toward your product or whatever it is you're trying to engage them with. But at the same token, you're also doing the surface of trying to bring that narrative together and us together around that same campfire, so to speak. So it's sort of a win-win-win when you think about it. And I can throw all the data out all day about why that's important. I'm happy to reference to it, but we know empirically that that is true. Is the more diversity, right, that you put into the storytelling, the ways in which you're talking and reacting, communicating with audience, the more successful you're going to be. And then the last thing I'd add is that, you know, as we think about sort of what inclusive storytelling means, I think we have to think about who's doing the storytelling. And so part about thinking about the organizations that you're a part of, or that you may run, depending on who you are in this call, how are you thinking about who is telling those stories? What is the diversity of the teams that are working on how you might be communicating with your audience, your consumers, et cetera, or within your own walls in terms of your employees themselves? And part of inclusive storytelling is not just the part that's the external facing part, right? Of how are you meeting and listening to your audience and having that two-way dialogue communication, but how are you also doing that internally? Because if folks don't feel within your organization like they can come around the same campfire, right? They can come around the same space and share openly and be who they are in whatever ways that means for them, then you're missing part of the valuable information within your organization, but you're also missing that opportunity to create shared narrative. And so I think when we think about why that's so important right now, there's sort of that macro sense, but there's also that very urgent sense even within your organization.
Definitely. Yeah, giving people the chance to be their most authentic selves is, I think, always like the recipe for success. So you're right. If people leave that out, there is a lot that they're missing that benefits everybody. So into my favorite segment, and I know a lot of people will be very excited for this. Can you share some very specific examples of how inclusive storytelling makes a difference?
Absolutely. And we're going to do a fun thing where I'm going to tie in technology to this conversation too, as you and I have prepped for this. And by the way, I should add that it's really important that there's high trust within your organization for people to be able to share their stories. And so part of storytelling is vulnerability. And the only way you build trust usually is through being vulnerable to each other. So the great opportunity in inclusive storytelling is shared vulnerability without penalty for that vulnerability. And that's the key part. I want to make sure to highlight that off of what you said, because I think it's really important as people are thinking both internally within their organization, but also with their audiences. So from examples, as you can see from the images, we are looking at Princess Tiana, but this is a very specific pulled image. So when I worked at Disney, and some of you may have read about this because it was in the news, we were working on Wreck-It Ralph 2. And there's this incredible scene where we bring all the Disney princesses and the Pixar princess, Princess Merida, into the same room with Penelope, and they are sort of in a relaxed state of mind that you haven't seen them in before. And so when we released the group photo of the princesses, you'll notice something has happened to Tiana in this image on sort of screen left here, where she's sipping from what is presumably a Frappuccino, in which her face has sort of changed shape in terms of the nose is sort of pulled in. The skin tone doesn't seem to be matching quite the shade that we understand Tiana to be from the 2D version of her film, right? And what happened here is multifold. So you're thinking, gosh, how could that happen within Disney? Well, when we were putting the film together, when you think about the technology that's behind animation, okay, it is riddled with any of the biases, machine learning or algorithms, right, that have been put into it or been taken right from somewhere else. If you know the history of filmmaking in any way, or photography more generally, Kodak color scales that were used for literally calibrating light and actually film itself for many years was based completely off lighter skin or white skin. And so a lot of the technology that's derived from the same color scale will automatically either burn out darker skin or lighten it within that shot. And so part of what happened is the lighting technology, first of all, that was behind, right, the lighting, the ability to light within a shot in Disney Animation Studio was actually biased with that same bias. And so what we see here is that's what's happened in terms of the skin tone. If you were to actually take the lighting off, her skin tone actually matches, but with the lighting applied, it actually lightens up her skin. Then when you think about the rig, so a rig is what is within an animated character that you watch, any of them, it's basically the skeletal system. And the skeletal system was programmed in such a way that also favored what you would consider sort of more traditional Caucasian or white features, right? And so the rig, when she takes a sip of the drink, was programmed to suck in the face in a particular way, which actually didn't work with the skeletal structure that Tiana actually has in terms of her facial features. And thus you get the nose changing shape and many other things. And so what I always love about this example is that, first of all, it hadn't been caught by any of us internally, including Black animators who had worked on it. We hadn't necessarily flagged it because it was a quick shot in the film. It was because it got pulled out as a still that we were actually able to see the issue, which first of all, I think is incredibly interesting, which is to say that sometimes things are slipping right through on you when you think about inclusive storytelling and opportunities. And it takes that pausing, right? That extra moment to look at something and say, wait a minute, maybe this is not right. The deeper note is one in looking at what biases are actually slipping into your processes and maybe even your technology that are actually creating a biased outcome to what you're looking for. And I love this example because it's so tangible. Like you can see like one to the other, what's happened here. And so the great learning out of this was that they actually went back and re-looked at all the lighting software and all the rigging, programming or algorithms right behind it, and actually adjusted it to start to, account for a greater amount of facial structures, of bone structures, right, of skin color. And now actually, when you fast forward to Encanto, you can see that this was not an issue because it was already addressed right here with Princess Tiana. And so I love this example because I think it shows how inclusive storytelling can show up in a really specific way within your processes, right? And by the way, we brought forth Anika Nani Rose, who was the voice of Princess Tiana, as part of this discussion, several outside organizations to be a part of how we kind of looked at this going forward. And by the way, it actually impacted several of the other princesses, by the way, by extension, in a wonderful way from this shot. And then also in the future, again, with Encanto and other projects. So that's one example. Another great case study, because Ari, you wouldn't let me leave without telling this one, is from the film Prey. I don't know if anybody has seen the Predator prequel that came out on Hulu. Anybody in the chat, feel free to chime in, because I know it was a fan favorite for those that love the Predator universe. But there's a great backstory to that project. And so highly recommend watching after this. So I'll tell you why. So when they first approached us from the 20th Century team, got a few people who have seen it, from the 20th Century team about making this film, we had a really deep conversation about the fact that the story was going to center on a young Comanche woman who was a warrior. And she was going to be the one to fight the predator. She's a teenager. And that we were going to set it in a time period right before sort of the quote unquote westward expansion of the United States, meaning a lot of what ended up becoming a massacre and conflict with European settlers and native and indigenous tribes and communities. And so as we were talking about it from the get-go, there was a move to say, we need to make this film in Comanche. Now, I'll explain why this is so important. For those who are not familiar, a lot of native and indigenous tribal languages have been lost to history, mainly because either communities were exterminated, taken off due to colonialism, quite frankly, and or have died out over time. And when you know that language is culture and culture is language, you need to keep the language alive to keep the culture alive. And so there was a great movement from the filmmaking team from the beginning that because this was going to go on streaming, here's another really interesting factoid, it was going to go on streaming, that we were going to make a full Comanche version. In fact, we wanted to make that version only, but we ended up having to make it in English as well. And what's incredible is because it went on streaming, we were able to have two separate titles, one for the English version and one for the Comanche version. And they got equal footing, which would have never happened if we did a theatrical film release. So the technology actually enabled a moment of equity around language and culture that we actually may have not been able to see otherwise. And secondly, you can go watch that Comanche dub right now on Hulu, and I highly recommend you do, because at least two of our lead actors dubbed their parts in Comanche fully. So you get their performance in their native language. And that you cannot, there's no price on that. That is the most amazing thing you could see creatively. The other part, by the way, that I want to acknowledge is Jane Myers was the producer on the film. She is from the Comanche tribe in Oklahoma. For our folks who are from Oklahoma, I saw we had some Oklahoma reps on the call, and she ensured that every representation of her own community was one that did not lean into some of those single narrative stereotype pieces we were talking about, which is like the sort of mystical native and all the other things that have permeated through storytelling. She ensured that that was not the case. And I think between her and the director and the intentionality around language, it was a home run of a film. And for all of you who are on the economic side of this, I just want to point out what I was saying earlier. We have a proof case. This film was set up from success from the beginning, and I cannot emphasize this enough. What they did was they created a budget structure that they knew could be profitable in streaming from the get, meaning they did not go over budget on this film. They were very specific around what was that target number that they could hit and make a quality film at the same time. And then also ensured, with Jane being clearly there in the process, that they were going to have a piece that felt both specific and universal at the same time. Because guess what, folks? It's very counterintuitive, but the more specific something is, the more universally it resonates, because it's great storytelling. Specificity is great storytelling. You want to know everything about your character. You want to know all the details, because guess what? It is in those details that you find yourself as an audience member fully connected with that character. And you can see that come through this movie in an amazing way. And so guess what? From that economic setup of the budget being priced in exactly the range it needed to be for streaming, the fact that they actually marketed this and used the opportunity in language, and then pushed it out with great support around it, right? These are key things. You need to not only do the work of getting your storytelling right, but you need to support it for success. So they marketed it, they put distribution obviously behind it, they featured it right up top on Hulu, and they featured the Comanche dub as well, right there. And in doing that, it is the #1 streaming movie ever on Hulu. And so this, just from an economic perspective, shows you what great, impactful, inclusive storytelling can do, and why, who's at the table, and how you think about details, including what kind of single narratives are you tackling, and then setting it up for success matters.
Yeah, I love that story so much. And I think that really goes to show that it all comes back to being intentional. It doesn't necessarily mean, the budget has to be huge. There just has to be a budget in the first place. And then if there's intentionality, success will follow. So I love that story.
See, we knew we had to tell it, folks. So everybody, if you take away, they're going to love me at 20th. If you take away anything from this talk, please go watch Pray.
Please. Yeah, please. Next webinar will be a review of the movie. Pray.
Yeah, exactly. We'll invite the producer and the executive director on, and how about that?
Awesome. So I think for folks in the audience who are really looking to take these strategies into their own organizations, maybe even their own lives, in what ways can business leaders bring inclusive storytelling into their own organizations? Absolutely.
And this is something, I think we have a good slide about this in the next one as well. I'm going to flip to the photo too. I think it's really important, a fun one, is that and I talked a little bit about this earlier, is that when you think about inclusive storytelling, right, bringing everybody around the fire, and it's like a yes and equation, right? That specificity actually brings more of us in. And so the more in which we can get away from the single narratives and the stereotypes and get deeper into the stories we're telling, that's actually where we find our shared humanity and our common humanity, and where also we start to change the weather in our brains, right? It's one of my favorite expressions from a New York Times review on Caste, the book Caste, which I highly recommend, from Isabel Wilkerson. And they're filming that film right now, actually in Georgia, FYI. Ava DuVernay is directing it, on a side note. It's about changing the weather in people's brains. It's not about telling people what to think. It's about inviting people to think differently. And what does that mean and do, right, in the alchemy? And so part of that is also the internal part of that. That's not just with your consumers, right? But thinking about internally, what are the narratives you put forward as an organization that might have been harmful, outrightly harmful, might have been missing, people in perspective, or might have not engaged employees in a way where you could have that feedback. I think about what you all do at Cool Leaf as a part of that example, right? Which is how are you engaging, right, the whole population within the organization and creating space, right, to have exchange and vulnerability. It's a bit of what we talked about earlier. And part of that sometimes is bringing the external and internal together. So, for example, you might have an employee resource group, right, from a particular identity group or intersection of identities. I've been very active in Latinx organizations in every place I've been, as well as the women's organization, because we're multitudes, as it turns out, we're intersections of many things. And the ability to bring together not only your employees in that conversation, but how can they also be in dialogue, right, with folks also from the outside and thinking towards something maybe specific. So a great example of this is the group you see here. So when I first started at Disney, the live action Aladdin was the first project that was brought to me by my boss, and said, and y'all, this is like 2 weeks in, okay, and said, they already had Guy Ritchie attached to direct. They already had a bit of a script. So in all full transparency, we entered a little bit later in the process than typically you want to be tackling an inclusive storytelling conversation. You want to be looking at that as upstream as possible. But part of what, for folks who don't know the history, the animated Aladdin that came out in 1992 was actually protested at the time for its disparaging portrayals of Arabs. And particularly the song Arabian Nights had a lyric literally about cutting off an ear. And so what they did at the time when the ADC, the Arab American, I think it's Anti-Defamation Committee, came forward, is that they changed the lyric. You can never actually find that lyric ever again in Arabian Nights after the original theatrical release. So when we got it on VHS, if anybody remembers that, the tapes before we had DVDs and then streaming, is that, they've changed it permanently. Now, if you go back and watch the animated Aladdin, there are a lot of stereotypes and sort of single narratives at play in what is also a cultural touchstone and a beautiful movie in other ways. And so part of what we decided to do was take a cue from Moana, who had done this first. And we brought together a cultural trust of an intersection of identities that might be connected to the Aladdin text. And we brought them sort of inside the company to have a conversation about the text, and also, from their various community standpoints, what are things to be thinking about? How could we be thinking about this differently? And it sort of created a cultural advisory board or a cultural advisory council. And part of that was also then connecting them to several of our employees who identify right in the same overlapping communities. So we had everybody from Arab Christians and Muslims, as well as folks who represented the Southeast Asian community, the Black Muslim community, and every intersection in between. And what I think, I know directly came out of all those engagements were changes that you saw in the live action Aladdin, if you put it side by side with the animated movie, that are very clear changes, from lyrics to costuming choices to even thinking about geography and trying to pull apart cultures that were culturally mixed, quite frankly, in the first one. But I think the other thing that was really important is it started to create dialogue internally between different teams that had never actually sat down and had these conversations before at any great level. And I cannot tell you what that did, not only for the employees that felt at the intersection of identities that are represented in Aladdin, but also for the larger team and organizations that were involved in making that movie and pretty much every piece of content that comes out of the company. It created a mechanism for inclusive storytelling amongst ourselves, if that makes sense. So suddenly it normalized the idea that we have these conversations as an organization. They are sometimes tough and complex, right? Like no community or identity is a monolith, shock and awe. And then the idea that no one community should have to carry the burden, or one individual should have to carry the burden of representing the entirety of their identities. And all of those conversations started to move the organization in a process way to actually be thinking about dialogue and movement forward. And for me, it's such a cool example of how you can think about within your organization creating space for conversations, but conversations that are productive toward an end or a goal, right, together. And in the process, you actually start to change culture within your company because you're building trust, you're building vulnerability, and it's all through the mechanism of storytelling, actually storytelling to each other, right, which actually means listening as well as responding, right? And then also maybe toward an actual product or deliverable that you're trying to deliver in the marketplace and in communication with the audience as well, right? And so, or in this case, we had a stakeholders that sort of represented our audience. And so that for me, I think is such an interesting way to think about how you change narratives internally and actually how you move culture internally with storytelling.
I think that is an excellent takeaway for the audience as well. Just that idea that you can connect different pieces of one organization, and that's a huge part of DEI right there.
Right.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It doesn't always have to be looking externally. It really, most times, is looking internally.
Right.
So with that, thank you so much, Julianne, for sharing your answers to these questions. We took you kind of everywhere throughout your journey, and got to hear some really amazing stories as well. So before we jump into the Q&A, I would love to share one of our favorite resources with everyone. We'll also include this in the follow-up email afterwards that goes out with the recording. So our DEI calendar for 2023 includes some really solid programming that will take you throughout the year so you can keep your DEI strategy going, not just during, one specific month. And this is updated by us frequently. So if you'd like to keep it bookmarked and reference it at any point in the year, please do so. And yeah, Teresa, my colleague, has dropped it in the chat. And again, we'll include it in the follow-up email afterwards.
Great.
Awesome. So before we jump into Q&A, one last bit, just the SHRM code for everyone. It's listed here, and Teresa will also put it in the chat. But again, we will include it in the email that comes as follow-up. So if you're looking to use this code for SHRM recertification. We will send that out to everyone afterwards. Awesome. So now I'm sure the audience is very excited to get their questions in here. Thank you so much, everyone, for being such an active audience. It's been great. So I guess we can start, Julianne, with a question from Jamie, Jamie Beth. So she says, oh, it's not a question. It's more of a comment. She just said that Mayim is the best, blossom forever. And oh, she also has a novel out, Jamie Beth's novel, Wasted Pretty. That's awesome. So we do have a question from Jeff Bond. He asks, are there any specific events, experiences that companies can design that foster this opportunity for storytelling?
Absolutely. It's a great question, Jeff. We started experimenting with this when I was at Disney, and thanks for the love in the chat, folks who are putting some love in there. One thing that you can do is actually use storytelling itself as a takeoff point. I have a very good friend who actually runs another business that focuses on this particularly, which is employee engagement through storytelling. It's actually using either whole pieces of content, so short films, episodes of TV shows, even movies, to create dialogue and space for people to be talking about how that impacted them. What did they take away from the film? What questions did it raise? Because sometimes actually talking about identity and the things that you're wanting to move forward in your organization can be easier when you're able to use a proxy for that conversation. And storytelling can absolutely be a proxy for that. So one way to think about it is, could you create a sort of series, right, of different pieces of content that folks can opt into to be a part of, almost like a movie club, but not, that they opt to be a part of, that meets at some regular cadence, and you either watch the piece together or watch individually at home, and you come together and kind of talk about, like, what did it mean? How did it impact me? What is that journey I went on? And I guarantee you, really interesting conversations around lived experience, around identity, around how people may be feeling in the organization will start to come out from that. And a good friend of mine, Emily Best, who runs a company that does this empirically with organizations, they have proven empirically cultural shift and change through guided discussion around content. The other great thing, of course, it does is that it can expose people to things they would normally not watch. Because if you think about the bias built in to our streaming platforms, they're based on algorithms of the preferences of choices we've made before, typically. So when you get the recommendation, often when you're consuming content, it's something that's already sort of biased to the things and patterns you've already demonstrated, which means you're missing out on a whole lot. And so what's really great about creating space for that in terms of engaging literally with storytelling is that it's not something that maybe can happen organically because of the way technology has developed. And if anybody's joining from a streaming platform, a place that does editorializing, that's something to think about, which is, how can you be actually in your business part of creating those dialogues as well. So just one suggestion, but there are many others.
Yeah, and I love that you touched on like the biases that are built in everywhere that we may not even think about unless they're brought up to us, which people in our organizations can also open up our eyes to. So we have a question from Kwanda in the audience. She says, I do community circles, My company is very ERGs heavy, all of which I think is incredibly important. But I think the next steps is getting those folks to come together in that cross-diverse group and have conversations so those groups don't just become silos. That's a great point. So she's just wondering your thoughts on that, Julianne.
Wanda, that is $1 million statement and question. So thank you for asking it. I think it is so important. Intersectionality is the story of our lives, really. We are all intersections of many identities. We're never just one thing at any given time, right? And so what you're bringing up is so important because there, as you know, there are real places and spaces where being in community with people who are like you or who have a shared experience, right? Or cultural touch point or lived experience, right? It can be incredibly important, but so important also to exchange between different areas of intersection. And by the way, anybody who actively identifies in more than one area of identity often feels pulled in multiple directions. I'm just, putting myself in that modality, right? It's like, how do I choose, right, where I go with all these groups, right? And so the opportunity is twofold. If you're bringing folks together to talk cross community, is first of all, that can create a level of trust and vulnerability we talked about that could start to build your culture forward in different other ways. It's a leveraging of power between different groups and identities of people to say, hey, we have a common issue or a common thing we'd like to explore further. Coming together actually gives you more sway, gives you more power. It also gives you more brain power. So the ability to actually think through what that might look like, what that might feel like, right? And then the third part about it is, of course, it feels far more inclusive to people, especially who identify across intersections of identity actively and live that experience. And so this question of like, I don't have to choose between sides of myself, I think is a very powerful notion. I usually talk about in some of my talks that the first time I saw myself on screen, reflected on screen, was Ugly Betty, or Betty La Fea, with America Ferrera, the US reboot of the Colombian telenovela. And I think the most powerful notion I took away from seeing her was this idea that I didn't have to choose between parts of myself to live in a society that wasn't always built for me, or a working environment that wasn't always built for me. And that the power in that concept, when you go cross intersections of identity, bring people together, I think is powerful. And then could unlock something else for your culture. So I think you're absolutely spot on. And I actually would encourage everybody to think about where are the opportunities to bring cross-cultural collaboration together, to build cultural competency together, to have that shared power, and to also embolden, right, the different intersections of our identity, either at the individual level or at the collective level. So I love that one, and I can't wait to see what you do with the community circles.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. Thank you for asking that question, Kwanda. So we do have time for, I think, one more question. And then I do want to remind everyone as well that you will be redirected to a survey afterwards. So please, if you have a moment to answer that, that'd be awesome. But Julianne, we have a question from Dora. She says, I've been using this book, The Learner's Journey, as a resource to design learning experiences. It thinks of a learning experience as a story that the participants tell about themselves. Seems to resonate with what you're doing. Do you also think of your participants' development as a story as well?
Absolutely, Dora. Another, man, we are just getting all kinds of $1 million questions. Dora, it was a phenomenal question. Yes, actually, is the short answer. I think that we are the protagonists in our life journey. We are. Some people come in and out of our lives who are major characters, right? Some people come in and out who are extras. They're there with us for a day and then they leave, right? They're background characters. And some people play supporting roles, right? And that really the design of our life is often very much a story and a narrative. So when I think about, you're absolutely spot on. When I think about the journey either of an organization or of an individual, so whether it's at the coaching level or the systemic level, storytelling is a great modality. Narrative is a great modality through which to understand what is actually happening. And because if you think about storytelling structure, which is a whole other seminar unto itself, storytelling is often a protagonist or a lead character who has an obstacle to a goal at a very fundamental level. And when you think about DEI work at a very fundamental level, it is essentially your protagonist, and there's an obstacle to an eventual goal of being a more inclusive, diverse, and amazing organization, right? Or individual, right? And so much of my job and the job of so many of us who do this work is to understand what are those obstacles? Are they self-imposed obstacles? Are they obstacles that are movable? Are they obstacles that are more entrenched? And how can we help move that journey toward the goal? And I think if all of you who are thinking about the strategy in your organizations, I highly recommend to start to think through it that lens, because it actually starts to give you a sense of timeline in a really different way. Because I think sometimes you think about, oh, we'll do something quick and we'll solve it. No. We're undoing and redoing hundreds, if not thousands of years of different behavior and different patterns and different processes, depending on your organization and as individuals. And so part of it is actually mapping it in an interesting way in that same time scheme, and thinking about how you can accelerate, how you can push, by understanding what is the actual obstacle to the goal. I also think, by the way, data is really helpful in that, because once you have the data and people are aware, then you start to understand, is it an unwitting obstacle, or is there an intentional obstacle, right? Because that also changes approach. So hopefully that's helpful, but I think, Dora, you just asked the $1 million question, and it's absolutely correct. Yes.
Yeah, these questions are fantastic. We do have one really, really solid one that I would love to answer before we go, from Nyadira. So Nyadira says, I'm currently an HR rep for my company. We're a diverse company, but lack a DEI path and DEI initiatives. I would like to propel these conversations at my organization. So there's a couple questions here. One, how do I break that seal and introduce DEI without pushback? Two, how can I manage pushback within my organization if there is any? And lastly, what are my next steps in order to be successful in a career in DEI? How do I enter this space? That's an excellent question.
Oh my gosh, so many questions in there. I know we have 2 minutes. I will do my best. And I believe she's also a Boricua, if I remember correctly from the chat. First off, it's awesome that you're recognizing that there is an opportunity here within your organization. And I tell you right now, sometimes it's not easy if there hasn't been a, aha, see, I knew it. Hi, hola. So first off, in your organization, here's a few things to think about. If you are senior in your organization, I would say to start to have conversations with fellow senior leaders and say, hey, these are patterns or things I'm noticing. I think there's a real opportunity for us to think about this at a deeper level. I'd love to start with one area. Do not try to do everything at once. I cannot say this enough. There is a lot to get done within any particular organization. So what I would say is, pick where either you have the amount of subject matter expertise that you could make impact, so like where you sit in the organization, and don't try to sort of like go for all of it at once. So always start with a pilot or with a focus, and because that's also where you can make most direct impact, and then find those accomplices, if you will. I don't love the word ally. Find those accomplices that will go on that journey with you to help, fight the good fight, so to speak. And if you are not in a senior leadership position, this is what I would recommend doing, is finding your colleagues who are either at your same level or just above in the structure of your organization to say, hey, this is something I've been thinking about. Is this something you would want to be involved in? Start to build a little team, and then say, who is that senior leader who seems to demonstrate some interest, whether through lived experience or through what they have said or demonstrated in the organization, who could be a champion for this work, and then bring them into the conversation once you've done a little bit of planning and thinking, okay, like not fresh, because they're busy too. And then say, okay, how do we then bring this to the senior leadership team with your sponsorship, and we can hone to that one project or that one area of the company that we want to start with. And it could be that you want to understand what the demographics of your organization, data collection, that could be one place to start. Another place to start is to say, hey, you see an audience opportunity with your product in that one area. Let's talk about how we could tackle that. And maybe that's where you start, but you just have to get started. Don't let the enormity of it overwhelm you, and find those accomplices no matter where you sit in the organization, and then have a team. Don't try to do it alone. And then from there, what will naturally start to happen is you'll start to realize you weren't the only one having this idea, usually, and people will start to glob on to whatever it is you're doing, and then success begets more success. You start with that one piece, and then you can start building from there, and also you can build the ask for resources alongside that. So hopefully that is helpful as you think about that. And I know we have people with duty calls, so I know they're logging off, but the other thing in this space is start to get involved in the work in your organization, even if it's not your formal role. And I would highly recommend starting to read different books that are out there by wonderful authors. I will shamelessly plug one of my best friend's books, Daisy Auger Dominguez, who's the head of HR at Vice. She wrote Inclusion Revolution, which is an incredible book about how to tackle this from within organizations, and very practical. So if you want a place to start there.
Fantastic. What a great way to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Julianne. I learned so much. I know everybody in the audience did as well. Again, thank you, folks in the audience. You've been wonderful. I feel like we've been talking with all of you just
It's been amazing. Yeah.
But yeah, there will be a survey at the end of this. Everyone will be redirected. We'll send out the recording as well as all the resources mentioned. So yeah, thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your Wednesday, a great rest of your week.
Muchísimas gracias.